Hey, hello everyone. Welcome to this week's Monday Assembly Ride. Got a topical conversation for you this evening, and also a somewhat topical course as we ride the third stage of the Tour de France. So we're just shooting forwards a week, pretty much. It should be pretty easy. I looked at the topo just a minute ago and it looks pretty aggressive, but there's basically about 200 meters of climbing and sort of 30 odd Ks, which isn't very much. So it's pretty chilled. For anybody that is new to these sessions, my name is Rich. I'm the head coach and founder of RIAK Fitness. We're a coaching outfit, and these rides basically just get whatever you want out of it. Just about to start in 3 seconds, but the rubber banding effect is on. So don't stress about kind of firing out the blocks, just relax. The rubber banding effect is on to kind of keep us all together. So basically you can ride as hard or as easy as you like, and in theory we should all sort of stick together. I'll be pootling around at sort of 2 watts per kilo, eventually anyway, once my legs sort of wake up. I'm on a recovery day today, so I've been sat down all day. I won't lie, and my legs don't feel attached to my body at the moment. So hopefully they'll wake up. But yeah, guys, get whatever you want out of this session. So if you want to kind of give it some beans, get yourself in the front, drive this on, you can do. Basically, the way the rubber banding effect is that, you know, whoever's working the hardest will go to the front, and if you're kind of having an easy day, you'll just sit to the back. You can actually drop off, but you basically have to stop pedaling and you'll get completely dropped. Otherwise, we should all sit together, as my avatar is now proving, so I go right to the back. So tonight's topic of conversation, we always have an in-depth discussion about something in these Monday assembly rides. The idea is that it's low intensity and it's just an opportunity for us to disseminate some coaching information, some coaching advice, answer any questions. So these sessions are intended to be interactive. So we've got the guys on Zoom, and for you, if you're watching the live stream, then please do feel free to leave comments and we'll pick those up as well. Which reminds me to open the chat box. There we go. So yeah, various ways you can get in touch, guys. Unmute yourself on Zoom or use the Zoom chat box. You can use the RGT chat, or you can leave comments on the live stream. We're across them all. Obviously, if you're watching this on demand, then yeah, we might not pick up those comments. But tonight's topic, we're talking about getting race ready, just avoiding some of the pitfalls. It's actually kind of a variety of topics within one, really. I'm not just talking about peaking. This is quite a topical conversation because it's towards the end of June now, and we're pretty much right into the thick of the racing, both triathlon and cycling. So I imagine some of you guys have got kind of big events coming up. I'm just going to give you some sort of top tips about how to kind of just keep yourself moving forwards. Okay, which is what I need for my avatar right now. Had quite a big week of training last week, so as I say, on recovery day. But as I said earlier, guys, feel free to ask any question at any point. It doesn't necessarily have to be related to the topic. Always helps. And I've said a number of occasions, guys, if you've got any topics you'd like us to cover in the future, always feel free to drop us a message, because we love kind of covering topics that we know you guys want to know about. And obviously what you want to know about might change different times of the year. Anyway, so just a little bit more about the course we're riding today. So as I said, it's the stage 3 of this year's Tour de France, and the Grand Depart is taking place in Denmark this year. So I'm going to do my best to pronounce some of these names, but it's not going to be pretty. So we're riding about 30 odd Ks to a place called Sonderborg. Okay, should be quite a chilled affair. You can see from the topo at the bottom of the RGT screen, there's very little climbing. There's a few little nudges to keep it interesting, but yeah, it's pretty flat, guys. This is definitely a sprint stage. So yeah, we kind of mixed it up. We've had some very hilly courses recently, and I always get abuse afterwards from various people. And this week we are perfectly flat, pretty much. So what you can do, guys, if you ever kind of need a helping hand, or just you're like me on a recovery day, one thing you can do is just go to the sensor settings in RGT and turn the trainer feedback right down. I've got it set to 0, so for me my trainer is simulating perfectly flat course, and that just enables me to sit at a constant power, or a relatively constant power, and just allows me to kind of keep with it as I'm talking. So that's just a quick reminder. Probably shouldn't be, I don't think it'll be too much of an issue for this session, but in future sessions it's good, useful FYI. So yeah, stage 3 of the Tour de France. Yeah, not always the biggest fan of the Tour de France though. I'm a bit of a grumpy bastard, full stop, but so you will struggle to get much positivity out of me generally, but Tour de France, just gonna say it, worst of the 3 Grand Tours by some margin, I would say. I don't know if anyone's got any particular opinions on that. I do welcome your opinions, as long as they're not too aggressive. I much prefer the Giro. Giro is my favourite, although this year it wasn't the best. Told you I'm grumpy. The Vuelta is always entertaining because it's sort of last chance saloon for many guys, and it's just absolute chaos. And usually the routes on the Vuelta a España is they're just they must have been like high when they created them or something. I just remember the best one ever was a mountain time trial with something ridiculous like 300 meters of climbing in 60k or something. I think it's designed by Joaquin Rodriguez or someone like that, who was retiring and he just didn't care, so he created this lunatic course. So that's one of the reasons the world is entertaining. Don't tend to get that sort of stuff too much in the Tour de France. Usually get a lot of crashes though, which you might find entertaining. Personally, I don't, because I know what crashing's like. Not fun. Yeah, so we're stage 3 at the moment, sprinters stage, and we're just rolling along, enjoying life hopefully. So tonight's topic, let's get on to that, shall we? Rather than my extremist views on Grand Tours. So we're talking about getting race ready and kind of looking after yourself in the build up, and this is particularly topical at the moment because the C word is on the rise again, and it just seems that everybody's at the moment, and as I said right at the start, we're kind of slap bang into the meat of the racing season, and it's creating me as a coach a few headaches, and also headaches for some of our athletes. But getting race ready, or getting kind of race sharp, however you want to term it, is got to be one of the trickiest parts of training and preparing, because there are so many different variables that feed into it, and really a lot of the time you're just kind of dependent on life doing you a solid, just giving you a break and being kind to you, which often isn't, as we've seen over the last 3 years. Getting conditions, getting fit is relatively straightforward in a kind of a broad sense, because ultimately it's about getting fit and being consistent, and there's a lot of science to back up modern training methodologies. There's a lot behind it, but when it comes to kind of getting race ready when it comes to get to peaking, there are so many variables, and it's so specific to the individual as to what works for them. So we kind of the way I work as a coach, don't want to speak for our other coaches, but I work off a 14-week build. So in the build up to a major event, we'll start kind of real focused training on that event about 14 weeks out. And it's in this time period where athletes are probably at the greatest risk of something derailing their preparations, because every week is important in that 14-week build. Whether you work up 12 weeks, some people 24 weeks, they do a real kind of 6-month focus on an event. It doesn't really matter. It's kind of that final push to the start line, which is when I think you can have your greatest levels of anxiety, particularly with the C word, and then also rail strikes, air strikes. Strike. So I should probably be clear on that. Strikes in terms of stopping services rather than bombs or whatever, which unfortunately is also topical at the moment. And then of course you've got all the other ridiculous kind of features of modern life that can interrupt your build. Don't worry, this session does get more positive, guys. I promise you. We're just going to cover a few kind of the negative stuff first, but I promise you I will cheer. I'm actually in a really good mood. You might not seem it. But yeah, we've got to cover off some negative stuff first, and then what I'll do at the end of the session is just a few tips on how to kind of manage the peak and the taper for your main event. Just some practical advice. But as I say, it's very individual. But what we'll start off with first is just how to avoid some of the more negative stuff. So the first one is injury. Okay, it's very common as people approach kind of peak training volume, that they start to pick up silly little injuries. They can be silly ones that are still pretty much unavoidable. I mean, I had one this year. I was building towards Manchester Marathon, sort of 2 or 3 weeks out. I was doing some hill reps, and I thought, I get bored of going up and down the same hill. I'll just do a little circuit instead. So I'll go down this little track rather than the pavement, and rolled my ankle, had a partial dislocation, just totally ridiculous. Should not have happened, but really, avoidable in the sense that I could have not gone down the track, but pretty unavoidable in terms of just luck, I would say. But then there's also stuff which are really unavoidable, that really are avoidable. Okay, talking things like muscle strains, stuff that you perhaps could avoid either through better decision making or through kind of just taking better care of yourself. And yeah, so I guess probably the primary message of this first section of the chat is that in the build towards your main event, it's incredibly important that you do all the little annoying things, the time-consuming things that we all don't really like doing, but help keep you injury free. So I'm talking primarily about strength training and stretching. So we'll start with strength training in a kind of race preparation phase, to whatever terminology you use for that kind of final phase before your main event. You might only do some strength training once a week. I do know some coaches say no, none at all. Personally, I think that's a massive error, because strength training is so important for maintaining muscular balance and for and maintaining kind of mobility. And in particular, if you've got kind of real areas of weakness, so for instance Achilles tendinopathy or something like that, you can't stop strength training. You have to keep it going, because otherwise it will flare up. Okay, so personally I think they're wrong. I think you should be doing strength training all season long, apart from kind of the couple of weeks before your main event. obviously I don't mean you're racking up the big weights and smashing the heavy squats. That's not what I mean. Your strength training should be periodized in the same way or similar way to your cardiovascular training. So I just having to work a little bit harder here. If you hear me heavy breathing, boys at the front are going on, I think, or I'm going slow, I'm not sure. Just trying to get back on the group. But yeah, keeping the strength work going. Like, you might be peak cardiovascular training volume, you might be doing 10, 15, 20 hours of training. You still got to keep the strength work, but you probably change it slightly. Shift down to sort of 1 session a week, keep it short, relatively light, doing core maintenance work, core and mobility stuff, and just trying to maintain muscular balance, because it's in that kind of peak training volume, particularly with cycling, where you start to pick up bad habits, pick up some kind of muscular issues. You'll notice it in your pedaling balance and things like that. And in fact, it is, as I say, it's important that you don't do lots of heavy lifting. So don't go the other way and do too much strength work in this phase, because strength training is a high risk activity. All right. And particularly if you're at high volume phase, it can send you over the edge. So definitely don't stop strength training. Just be careful what you're doing. In fact, we're just kind of finishing a series at the moment. Our total workout series is designed for the phase that we're in. It's short and sharp and focusing on a couple of key areas. So maintaining hip stability, glute activation, things like that. So if you're looking for some strength training, we've got, I think, 1 or 2 sessions left, but it will be available on demand soon. So if you need something to kind of keep you going, but without kind of ruining you, then that is a good series. Keep up the rehab, the prehab, and the stretching. So I talked about if you have Achilles issues or shoulder issues or something like that, and you have kind of a routine, or you've had sort of rehab stuff from the physio from a recent injury, don't stop. Keep going. I see it all the time when athletes have injuries. They'll do sort of maybe a few months of rehab and they'll stop getting pain, and then bin the rehab. Doesn't work like that, guys. You gotta keep doing it. You gotta find the core, the source of the issue. It's rare that an injury finds its source, its real fundamental source, just at the area of pain. Things like knee issues. Typically the issue isn't the knee as such, although that's where the damage is. It can be around the hips, like you've got weak glutes, poor abductor strength, internal rotation of the hip, all this stuff. So you've got to work on that and don't stop. And then stretching. So we say to our athletes, you need to stretch after every session. I know that's controversial. Some people will wholeheartedly disagree with that, but it's a pain and time consuming. But during a race prep phase is when it's so crucial to keep up the good habits. So stretching after every session, keeping up the rehab work, particularly if you have historic issues, is so important for kind of keeping those very much avoidable injuries at bay, the muscle strains in particular. Because with the high volume of training, as you're peaking at peak volume, it can be easy to skip the stuff because you're tired and you just kind of want to eat and chill out. But it's the most important time to stay on top of it, because it's when you're at your highest risk. So, push through, keep it going. And also you'll find that if you're staying on top of this stuff, it will help you with your consistency, it will help you with your motivation, because you'll feel better between sessions if you're kind of in a high volume phase and just still feeling tight and sore and stiff from previous sessions. You're more likely to bin the next one. Okay, so really be strict with yourself and let's avoid those injuries, because I see it so often people kind of get in within a month of their race and then they pick up an injury, which is super avoidable. Okay guys, so restrict yourself. You need stretch routines. Head to our website, training resources section, which is on kind of all three of the main pages. There's stretch routines on there. Okay, upper body, lower body, dynamic stretches for doing as part of a run warm up. You know, it's there, the help is there. Okay, really recommend using it. And then the final thing about avoiding injury is it's just making smart decisions with your training. You might be in a peak training phase. That doesn't mean you need to smash yourself to pieces every day. Okay? It is easy to slip into a mentality that it's kind of like exam season. You know, when you're doing your exams, you feel like you always have to be revising. And I think that kind of mentality can slip in when you're in a peak training phase. You kind of think, oh, I have to be training. I have to be, you know, every week, every 3 hour I've got, I need to be on the bike or I need to be running. But you've got to keep making smart decisions and about the volume that you're doing, the other factors in your life. Can you actually sustain that volume? Can you sustain that intensity? Your body's not a machine, and you have to be listening to the messages it's sending you and adapting your training accordingly. And you'll come through that high volume period in better condition. You might not have done everything perfectly, but that's not our aim. Remember, our mantra is always about consistency rather than perfection. Okay? Or if you kind of flip it another way around, if you're a slave to your plan, don't listen to how you're feeling and force yourself to that session you're too tired to do, surefire way of picking up injury or illness. Okay? And then if you've got those little niggles, it can be stuff that you kind of then have to manage all the way and through your race day. So just kind of using cues from your body and any objective metrics that you've got, you know, heart rate variability, you know, that sort of thing can become useful, particularly when it comes to avoiding illness, which I'll talk about in a minute. But in terms of injury, intensity becomes, I think, kind of a big factor. You know, using an example, you know, not so much now, but very early in the season when I was doing a bit of kind of winter duathlons and stuff like that, I was getting quite tight calves, and it usually came from, I do a lot of my running off-road on the trails, and some of the trails were pretty hard packed, and I was wearing kind of full mud trail shoes. Anyway, the reasons aren't important, but basically, well, not interesting, I should say. Basically, I was getting quite tight calves after my structured run sessions, and basically, I had to make some smart decisions about the way I trained and how I spaced out my run sessions and how much intensity I did. You know, you can't be a slave to your training plan. There's some very sort of commonsensical things you can do to keep those injuries at bay. You know, if you're feeling tension in the muscle, in your calves as an example, then going and doing a speed session, or those calves are already, you know, coiled like a spring, that's obviously going to put you at risk. So, you know, doing a lighter session, or, you know, moving sessions around so you've got time to recover before that next run session. You know, none of that is rocket science. It's about taking the ego out of the equation and doing what's right, doing what's going to keep you moving forwards, and not necessarily about achieving perfection. I feel like this ride this evening is a lot faster than usual. I wonder what I've set the bots at. We do throw in a few bots every now and then. Oh, this is moving very quickly. I feel more out of breath than I am usually. I can't be my fitness because I'm in a peak training phase as well. Okay, so we talked about injury, I'm just going to pause a second, have a little check of the chats, and if anyone on Zoom wants to ask any questions, now's a good time. Let's have a little quick check, see if anything's come in. So I've been yammering away. Yeah, let's give it another minute in case anyone's got any questions. Yeah, of course, go ahead. Okay, that's an interesting question. Yeah, so the question was about, during the kind of 14-week build that we use, do we focus on ramp rate and TSS, etc. in training peaks? To a certain extent, yeah. Again, I think one of the issues we have with training peaks is this isn't an issue with training peaks as such, it's just an issue between the compatibility of the methodology that I use and training peaks. So training peaks, you get penalised quite heavily for recovery, and it works on quite a traditional model typically, where you kind of like, how to describe it, yeah, you kind of, so I'm trying to think of a way of describing this. Usually it's easier for me to describe it if I go on a rant, but considering we're live streaming this, I have to be more careful about what I say. Yeah, you get perhaps overly penal, because training peaks works on a quantification of stress and recovery. It doesn't work as well with the way that we train. So our approach is to kind of chip away at fatigue. So every 3 or 4 days, our athletes will have some form of recovery, and it just means that the CTL, which is kind of like quantification of your form, it's not always reflective of where an athlete actually is at. So we rely much more heavily on benchmarking sessions to see where an athlete is at. Particularly with triathlon, I find the metrics that Training Peaks uses aren't great for swimming. Okay, so I was using an example, like I did a really tough swim on Saturday, and it probably gave me, I'd say, like 2/3 of the TSS that I should have gotten for it. And so yeah, you have to use kind of the metrics as a guide. I personally don't rely on it too much, because I just think there's too many other variables going in for those quantifications of fitness and form to be that reliable. They can be useful in terms of making sure you've got progression in a program or what have you. I think a lot of it comes down to experience as to how reliant you are on it, but they can be useful for ensuring that you've got overload and etc. But I do think you get overly penalised for recovery when you're using kind of a strict quantitative system like that. When you're working with amateur athletes, when you're working with pro athletes, I think the data going in is much more accurate, and they don't have any other, they have much less stimuli outside of their training. But with amateur athletes, you just can't quantify the effect of, you know, like a 50-hour working week. That's a lot of hours to work, isn't it? I don't know, if someone's working sort of 12, 13 hours a day, you can't, how do you quantify that? So yeah, it's useful. Personally, I don't rely on it, but it can be good for providing like an underlying structure to a plan. Have I answered your question at all? I kind of got bogged down there a bit. Yeah. But, yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, so I'll just paraphrase the question. Was is the training load linear, building up towards your event? Yes and no. In terms of like a macro plan, yeah, it'll be, you'll start at, the goal will be to start at sessions of around a certain TSS, a certain training score, and then over the course of the 14 weeks or however long the build is, that the overarching TSS of the sessions will have increased. However, in the structure that we follow, it's kind of broken up. It's not linear, as the expression you use. There's peaking and troughing, but ultimately you get to the right place. So we will have high volume weeks interspersed with what we call transition weeks, which are lower volume, much lower volume, but higher in intensity. Okay, so that's how we'll do things. So the idea is that in those transition weeks, you'll have much less volume, and so hopefully overall feel a bit fresher, but we will have put in maybe some speed work or something like that to up the intensity a bit, sharpen you up. So yeah, overall you'll get your overall loading will increase, but it's not, I would say, a perfectly linear process. Does that answer your question? Perhaps just makes it more unclear. Okay. Yeah. 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 No worries. Thanks for the question. I think for kind of more detail on that, we did do a session a while back on structuring your training. One of the sessions I've made is available on demand on our website. The other session, because we kind of gave away a bit too much in the Q&A, I haven't made available. But yeah, guys, I mean, on our website, if you want to know more about our methodology and how our training plans work, you can book yourself in for a free coach consultation. So it's only 15 minutes, so we'd have to cram a lot in. But if you're interested in our methodology and our training plans, that we can clarify a little bit in that time. Otherwise, guys, drop us an email and we can try and explain a little bit more. But there is a session where we talk about the way we structure things. There is a second one which I don't think is public now, because yeah, we kind of gave a little bit too much away. Not that we're, super special, but it's that don't necessarily want to be giving stuff to other coaches, because as a breed we will steal things, myself included. So and that's kind of the beauty of the industry. You all give each other information and share information and take what you think is good, and etc. Right, anywho, so we talked about injury. Just going to say a few points now on avoiding illness, and this will be particularly pertinent at the moment with COVID on the rise, the C word. At the moment, this is a complete nightmare for a coach. It is everywhere. I can't remember how many athletes we've got either testing positive at the moment or kind of recovering. I think it's at least 4 or 5. Yeah, and it's not just COVID. You know, we've got all the other stuff coming out of the woodwork now that we're kind of out in public again. It's a bloody nightmare. Yeah, whilst COVID is not as serious as it used to be, it is still, however, a probably say at least a 2-week recovery cycle. So at least 2 weeks where you're not going to be kind of training at full speed, okay, and pushing things on. So just bear that in mind, anyone. I was talking to Guess before we came on about a little protocol we've just given some of our athletes to help them, because there's so many of them that are ill, just to help them through it. And getting ill in the lead up to your main event can really derail things. I've had it this year on 3 occasions, 3 races I've had to miss as a result of illness. And so whilst there is only a certain amount you can do, there are things you can do, guys. Okay? Firstly, keep an eye on the amount of intensity in your program. So high intensity training does depress your immune system a little bit and can leave you vulnerable to bugs. So, you know, just managing the amount of intensity. If you're feeling kind of a little bit, what's the expression? If you're feeling a bit worn down, consider whether that really high intensity set is going to help you in that regard, or whether you'd be better placed kind of pushing it back, having some more recovery, or changing the session completely and going for more low intensity work. Okay, again, that's where kind of listening to your body comes in. Just because a coach tells you to do something, they're not living in your body, tracking you second by second. So you do have to use your common sense sometimes. So yeah, being careful with the amount of intensity in your plan and the frequency of intensity as well. So one of my main bugbears, no pun intended, is about HIIT training, you know, circuit training in gyms. It's just, people are always ill when they do it. And it's because, you know, when you're doing high intensity training 4, 5, 6 times a week, however often you go to HIIT classes, it's too much. Your body can't support that level of intensity. Yeah, I've just had people that I've looked after that just go through illness after illness as a result of having just too much intensity in their lives. Okay, so really listening to your body, having the confidence to adapt your training depending on how you're feeling. I'll just give you an example. I had a really high volume training week last week, but I dropped the intensity in a couple of sessions. Now it's easier for me, obviously. I know kind of exactly what the cause and effect is, etc. But I still make mistakes. But I just knew I wasn't recovering as well as I should, and knew if I went too deep, if I did that. I'm trying to think of the example. I think it was a brick run, the high intensity brick run. I knew if I did it as planned, I would get ill and injured. Like, I was that certain. Just feeling that underlying level of fatigue that we're probably all familiar with, but don't always give the requisite level of respect. And I made a sensible decision on that occasion, thankfully, and managed to recover the next day and was all good. But I don't always do that, you know, because experiences you like, but you also have to take the ego out of the equation. But there are some more practical steps you can do that can make a bit of a difference. So this potentially might be patronising, but we're just going to go through the list anyway. Carrying alcohol gel with you. I think most of us probably used to that now, particularly when using public transport, because they are filthy. Public transport is disgusting. I remember watching a report once, this is a few years back, where they tested the London Underground for fecal matter, so poo basically, and it was everywhere. They tested handrails, seats. It was shocking, and also an alarming amount of semen as well, which I don't want to think about too much. But the point is, guys, when using public transport, you know, cleaning your hands afterwards, it just should be habitual, in my opinion, because it is pretty rank. One that might be a bit controversial, and perhaps, you know, not super science driven, but wearing a mask in public, if nothing else, it might just help you feel a bit less anxious. I'll skip over that one because I know that one can get people a bit riled up, so I'm just going to move on. And another kind of controversial one, because we're in that kind of mood this evening, avoiding public events or limiting contact with people in the final couple of weeks before an event. That might sound like a draconian approach, but if you think about it, pro athletes will go into a holding camp before the Olympics or something like that, big competition, where they literally see nobody for about a month. And that's purely to kind of keep bugs at bay, to make sure that they're healthy when they get to their event. I'm not saying you cut yourself off for a month. I'm just saying being a bit strategic about weekends away, or, you know, big events, going to concerts, whatever it is, just in a couple of weeks leading up. Because, as I said earlier, I've missed 3 or 4 events due to illness. That's a shitload of money down the drain. And I can pinpoint where I caught illnesses, the specific occasions as a result. And it just, for me, I think that's probably one of the biggest changes I'm going to make to my approach next season. Is personally, I'm not seeing anybody 2 weeks before my major events. I don't care who they are, okay? And I really recommend it to you guys as well. If it's something you really care about, it's something you train hard for, you know, 4, 5, 6 months, you've spent money on travel, on the event itself, I think doing things like that is perfectly reasonable. You don't have to explain to people, just say you're busy. You can have a big party afterwards and make up for it. But I think actually, out of this session, that is the biggest one I've learnt this year, okay? Yeah, okay, moving on, sick. Making sure you get plenty of sunlight should be an easy one. So vitamin D is super important. It will help boost your immune system, and also get sunlight on your skin will help improve your sleep, because your body will be able to regulate your circadian rhythms, your sleep hormones more effectively. So getting sunlight on your skin makes a big difference from a number of different aspects. Or if it's a winter event we're talking about, and you're sort of northern hemisphere or northern Europe, taking a vitamin D supplement to boost your immune system. I don't generally push supplements because you shouldn't really need them if you're doing things right, but for the northern Europeans in particular, a vitamin D supplement during the winter months, I'd say is pretty much a must, because we just don't have any sun. Eating well, okay, in the build up to your race, and avoiding alcohol. Not completely, I'm not one of those people as coaches that says you shouldn't drink in 3 months before your race or whatever, but just sort of, you know, just keeping it sensible really, because it really dehydrates you, and then if you're dehydrated and had poor sleep quality, again that will impact your immune system. If you're then also doing high intensity training, you can see how this can snowball. Okay, eating well, I don't mean eating like an angel, but just making sure you're eating enough to support your training and you're eating the right things. So you might have seen that Total Endurance Nutrition did a post recently on social media about this, about how what you eat can really impact your immune system. So we're talking, you know, sufficient protein intake, things like that, you know, getting the right nutrients in. So there are some practical steps you can take in the final few weeks leading up to your event to make sure, well, not make sure, but to do your best to avoid illness. You know, it's all the really commonsensical stuff like hygiene, but potentially being strategic with what you do in those final few weeks, and getting sun on your skin. Okay, so that's the negative stuff. That's avoiding injury and illness. Just pause again in case you've got any questions before I'm then going to move on to some more practical stuff about training, kind of getting peaking for an event and tapering. And that should take us to the end. I really feel like this ride has been absolutely shifted. I'm knackered. I'm usually very able to sort of put it around. Have we got some apps? Let's see who we've got on the ride this evening. We've got some absolute monsters at the front. I see a couple of guys pushing on at 2.5 watts per kilo. Maybe that's it. Yeah, up to 3.5 watts per kilo there. Yeah, I think we've got some absolute beasts on the front. Fair play. I did say get what you want out of this session. We're just at different ends of the spectrum. Right, let's have a little quick chat of the chats. See if there's anyone coming in. Otherwise I'll move on. Okay, cool. So, firstly, getting very sharp, peaking for an event can be super tricky and very individual. Essentially what you're trying to do is you're trying to make sure that your volume, your training load peaks, and then there's some sort of recovery so that your body kind of improves. You get fitter, because remember, in order to get fitter you have to recover. Your body needs a little bit of you need to decompress a little bit, release the pressure valve so that your body can adapt and get stronger. And that's what you want to do, that's what you're looking to do with your peaking and tapering. So your body reacts to the stimulus and you kind of ride the wave of that extra strength before it starts to drop off. Now, doing this properly, kind of peaking and tapering, generally speaking, it's hard to do it more than twice in a season for major events, okay? Because you need, when you peak and you do your event, there has to be kind of like a drop-off period, a detraining period, before you can kind of start to build again, because you have to recover, particularly if you're doing kind of a really big endurance event, something like an Ironman. It does real deep-seated damage to you, okay? Your muscles will recover in a matter of days, but I'm talking things like the impact it has on your hormones. You know, it can really throw them out of whack. You know, the micro tears on soft tissue, inflammation in the respiratory system, which people often don't kind of even think about. But that tight chest and a little bit of a cough you get at the end of a big event, that's inflammation. You can't stress that even more. You need to let that recover. So doing this proper, doing kind of a peaking, a tapering, and going again, you can only do that a couple of times in the season, really. Just because you need a big gap. You need, once you have that peak and taper, you have your event, you then need a recovery period where you kind of get on top of all that stuff we just talked about and then look to build again. And when you actually work that out in kind of temporal terms, it's just actually physically difficult to have enough time to peak more than twice in the season. So as an example, for an Ironman, you're talking probably 6 weeks of recovery before you're ready to go again, ready to start building again. I don't mean you don't train for 6 weeks. I mean you need at least a couple of weeks of pure recovery, and then you've probably got another 4 weeks where your expectations in terms of what you can do in training have to be pretty low, and your volume needs to be low. Because you can't just keep perpetually building, because you'll just crumble. We're not machines. So it's important you plan your season in advance and build in recovery time between events, so that you're able to then build And it doesn't matter if you detrain a little bit. If you do your big event and you've got another one sort of 12, 14, 16 weeks away, you have to get a bit unfit before you can then build beyond where you were before. You can't just have a week off and then go again. You have to properly recover and then build beyond where you were. Okay? So that's kind of peaking. It's not as, it's really tough. It's a hard thing to get right, and it's super individual as to how you peak someone. And also kind of their event can really complicate things. So if you've got somebody, so we look after quite a few cyclists, and they'll race for several weeks at a time. And it does actually mean, whilst they're going through a block of racing, they'll probably lose quite a lot of form, which I'll talk about in a second in a bit more depth. So I know some of the people watching this might be cyclists rather than triathletes. But tapering, if we just move on to that, and I'll bring it all together, is a real dark art. It is something that is really tricky to get right. Tapering is basically the recovery element of peaking for an event. You're refreshing, allowing those adaptations to take hold from that big stimulus. And refreshing it during your taper should be the primary aim of those weeks, okay? So don't use your taper. I see it time and time again when we take on new athletes. You feel a bit like they haven't perhaps followed their plan as well as they could have, and they squeeze in some extra training in their taper, and it's just, they get to race day and they don't necessarily have the performance that they could have had. It is better to go into your event slightly undercooked and really fresh than to go into it with too short of a taper and you're still just knackered. Okay? In terms of all kind of practicalities of taper, the way it works is you'll probably have your highest volume week with the most training, your hardest week, and then look to taper down into your event so you're fresh and ready to go and really benefit from that big training stimulus that you've just had. How long you taper for and by how much you drop your training volume and intensity depends on the event and the athlete, and this is where it gets super complicated and really you have to look at it on an individual basis, because personally I don't like a very long taper. I'm not quite sure why I don't. I don't perform well off a long taper. I think it's probably down to the nature of my job and my lifestyle. Like, I'm always doing sessions like this, always doing something, and so if I take my foot off the gas too much, I think my body kind of slips into like a real recovery mode. So basically I would benefit from having 6 months off completely, probably, because my body's a wreck. But if I taper too much and drop off the intensity too much, I can feel really sluggish when it comes to race day. And so, you have to, it's trial and error to a certain extent. But coming back to the cycling, if you're racing regularly, you might not even taper for an event, or you'll just taper for the one big event in your season that you're targeting. And in fact, as I said, one of the problems with racing week in, week out, whether that's cycling or triathlon, is you lose form. And this is because you have to recover from the race, but then it really limits the amount of training time you've got to try and kind of improve. And so really you kind of get stuck in this cycle of race, recover, with not much kind of stimulus in between to kind of improve you. And that's why you'll see lots of pro cyclists, they'll just randomly in the middle of the season, they'll take maybe a couple of weeks off racing and they'll go on a training camp, a high volume camp. And they do this often before a major event. So the classic example is cyclocross. Okay, so before the world champs, the big names, they might take a couple of weeks off. So if they're a month out, they might take a couple of weeks off, do a big block of training, then do a couple of weeks of racing, And actually that racing kind of acts as like a taper, because suddenly their training volume drops dramatically, and it means they get to the world champs both fresher and sharper, because they've had that big training stimulus, then they've had a lower volume period, but also getting that racing in, so they're sharp. Okay, so yeah, it can be complicated, it can be difficult when you are racing a lot. You have to just really structure your season and be planned and figure out which races you really want to target, and then you fit in your taper and your training accordingly. So general rule though for a taper, and this is very loose, but generally you're talking sort of a weekly drop in training volume of about 25 to 30%. Okay, and how long your taper is depends on the event. So you're probably talking at least 2 weeks for an Ironman, for example, and then probably less for kind of a bike race. And you can start getting a bit complicated, but you can have sort of like little mini tapers where you just freshen up a little bit before a race. You're not necessarily kind of really having a proper taper. So yeah, a bit of a dark art tapering. I think that the key point to make though is, if you've got something you really want to be fresh for, your big event, tapering is important. And you can only really kind of do a peak with the proper taper a couple of times a season. Okay, I think those are the main takeaways. And then in terms of those 2 weeks or 3 weeks or just 1 week, you're looking for a very general drop in training volume of about 25 to 30%. But again, that's super loose. It really depends on the athlete, their preferences and the event. So coming up to the final few hundred meters of the course, actually well timed because that's all I've got to talk about. But let's do a very quick summary if people are willing to stick around, just so I can just tie it all together. But basically what we talked about in this session is getting race ready and kind of keeping yourself race ready until you get to your event. So avoiding injury by making sure you're still doing strength training in the main build to your big event. You know, you might drop it down to once a week, and you might move into kind of more maintenance strength work. So not super high loading, but just working on the key areas, maintaining muscular balance and things like that. Keeping up with the rehab and prehab if you have a historic injury. Don't ever stop doing that. You might stop strength training completely sort of a week or 2 weeks out from your main event, but just keep doing it. Making smart decisions about your training volume, listening to your body, and particularly when it comes to intensity and kind of tension in your muscles to avoid picking up stupid muscle strains. And then stretching after every session. Just get it done, guys. Don't allow yourself an excuse, just make it part of your routine. We talked about illness, avoiding illness, some of the practical steps, basic hygiene, alcohol gel, etc. Being strategic over your social life in the lead up to your big event, so you don't end up getting disappointed. Getting plenty of sunlight on your skin and eating properly. And then in terms of kind of peaking and tapering, I've talked to you about kind of the process very loosely, because it isn't kind of a super structured thing. But you can only do it maybe two times in a season. But making sure that when you're tapering, your goal is refreshing yourself, is recovering for that main event, and you're not squeezing in extra training unnecessarily, because it won't benefit you. All what happen is you'll be knackered for your event. So just remember, it's better to go in a little bit undercooked and really fresh than going in kind of knackered from some last minute training you squeezed in. So there you go, guys, that's kind of the hour, and that's the end of the course. I will just stick around just in case anyone's got any questions, and do always feel free to ask, guys. But just chats and stuff. See if there's anything that's come in. No worries. Take care, mate. Cheers, guys. Thanks very much. Just hang on a second in case there's anything coming in from the live stream. But otherwise, guys, hopefully you found that useful. I think a big part of this just comes down to maybe being, particularly when it comes to the illness front, just being a little bit selfish. You know, if you worked very hard and spent a lot of money on training or the event itself, I think, guys, just do what you need to make sure you get there in shape and healthy. Because I think we've perhaps all had it where we've not been able to do an event because we've been injured or ill, and it is honestly like, it's miserable. It makes you get so frustrated. You know, I wouldn't lie, I've shed a tear or two when I've not been able to do an event as a result. And so I think it's really worth kind of doing some of the stuff that we talked about in this session to make sure you get there, because yeah, it's just not, I just don't think it's worth not doing so. But anyway, there you go, guys. If you've got any questions after the fact, do feel free to message us either on social media, or you can email us at info@riak.fitness. But yeah, thanks very much for your company, everyone, and hopefully you found some of that useful. Cheers, guys. Take care.